Hello and welcome to the Womb Centered Healing Podcast. I'm Selma Morningstar and I have Laura here with me today. Thank you so much, Laura, for joining us. I met Laura online as usual, and Laura was sharing about this project, this craft project, sacred embroidery you're doing. But as far as I understand, not everyone is doing embroidery, but I don't know. You're going to clarify because I didn't get the whole scoop yet. But what I do remember is that this project is to commemorate witches who were burnt at the stake. Is that right?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, Sama. The project is called the Medicine Spoon Memorial, and I think specifically it's to honor the witches who were persecuted in the UK during the burning times. However, my understanding is that depending on where they were persecuted, whether it was Scotland or the south of England or Ireland, it may have been that they were drowned, it may have been that they were hung, it could have been that they were burnt. So I think it's possible that there were many different iterations of their stories.
And this is based on records, I'm imagining.
Yes.
That someone that is heading up this project has researched and found these records and is giving out names and perhaps some details about each of these persons' identities and lives to people like yourself who want to do some sort of commemorative project. Could you tell us more about how all that works?
Yeah, so the artist's name is Karen Thompson, and she is part of a sisterhood that is a project by Callie White, and she runs the Silver Spoon Collective, and it is essentially ancestral healing of the witch wound. And so Karen has taken from her part in the Silver Spoon Collective, she's kind of, as an artist, she's decided to go, and as you say, there is actually online quite a lot of information. And what she does is that she has printed these memorial medicine spoons onto pieces of fabric, all different fabrics, and I think there's 9 different types of spoons, and all that she sends you is the name. So you can go and do the research yourself as to who this person was. And I actually think that that is almost part of the unfolding of the journey of going on this. But I guess we can talk more about kind of how I've gotten to that.
Wow, I'm fascinated. So do you receive this printed medicine spoon on the fabric, and then you
Yeah.
go and research this person's name and find out what you find out, and then you're embroidering. What are you embroidering? Can you show us? You're embroidering onto the fabric, or maybe other people, does everyone embroider onto the fabric, or what?
Yeah, I mean, from what I've seen of the spoons that have been sent back to her on her Instagram account, she started to kind of put up the pictures. There's such a variety, and I think ultimately she just wants everybody to go on their own journey and to memorialize it in whatever way. So that might be embroidery, but it could equally be quilting or sticking or sequins or anything. It could be anything. The only caveat is that the name has to be somehow put on to the spoon, and that we leave enough of a border, because they're all going to be put up in this incredible project. Hundreds and hundreds of spoons are all going to be exhibited together.
So it's going to be an art exhibit. So these
Yeah.
fabric spoons are going to be displayed. I was thinking, would they be quilted together?
I
Or
don't know yet. Yeah, I don't know.
okay, so this is in progress, work in progress. That's going to be this big collaborative thing. So can you show us your spoon so
Yes.
far?
Yes, so far, this is my spoon. I'm sorry, the name is backwards, but her name is Anne Crab.
Uh-huh.
Um, and as you can see, we get the spoon um, And I've done something quite specific. I think ultimately you might start with the spoon, just a blank inked black spoon.
Uh-huh.
So yeah. Um,
But you
but
you put it so that the spoon is stirring in the cauldron,
yeah,
fire
yeah.
underneath it. So what did you learn about Anne Craft?
Yeah, so really interestingly, Anne was persecuted by another woman, and it would seem from the records that the other woman accused her of causing her leg to fall off. So I'm assuming it was gangrenous, and I don't know whether perhaps she went to her as kind of some kind of healer or wise woman witch. I have no idea why she ended up accusing her of this. But it essentially, that was the crime that she was persecuted for causing another woman's leg to rot off. So really interesting. Yeah, yeah.
And so
I
where did you find this record? I mean, how did you do this research?
It's quite easy. On Google, there is a UK, some amazing person has compiled a very decent explanation of all of the records that were actually really good, because once the Hammer of the Witches came out, the they kept the most amazing records of what they did and how they taught these women a lesson. And so it's really quite harrowing, because you can see exactly what they did, whether they used the Iron Maiden, whether they pulled teeth and nails, whether they were hung. Yeah, and it's a real, that really ignites the witch wound in us, doesn't it, to even acknowledge that this is something that is a collective shadow for women. um
And not only women either. I mean,
of course, yeah,
homosexual men were often accused of being witches, and I imagine even heterosexual men that were into herbalism, or
yeah,
even too devoted to their empowered wife, or you know what I mean. I mean, I'm
absolutely,
sure that
yeah,
there's plenty of people, not just women, that were
yeah,
persecuted for similar reasons. And it reminds me of part of my heritage, which is um, how the Native American people were persecuted by the Catholic Church for the, especially particularly in Mexico, and and the whole Inquisition of anyone who was practicing Native American, indigenous spirituality practices. And one of my mentors was a poet who, Francisco Alarcón, who you can look up, because he did a similar project for some of his poetry, where he found records kept by the Catholic Church that were the only written records of the practices themselves that his indigenous ancestors were engaging in, but in the context
wow,
of being recorded as guilty verdicts for these people, and then what was done to them for practicing this or that practice. And so some of his poetry, at least one of his poetry books, was reclaiming those practices from the horror of those records, and reclaiming that heritage, and putting it in writing in an honoring, sacred way. And so it seems very similar to what you're doing here. And I have a big curiosity about if there are records like that in the United States, because there were tons of, not only for witches, but I'm sure that there were Catholic Church things going on against Native American and other practices as well, um,
mm,
indigenous practices, and like that. And yeah, so it's just opening up this, like, what other projects could happen like this, and would this, I mean, this sounds like a practice for in the UK, but curious if this artist might want to collaborate with somebody who might want to find the records in other parts of the world where similar things have taken
Yes,
place and do some
absolutely.
so, well, so tell us a little bit more about you, Laura, and your womb-centered healing journey. And there must have been there's got to be things that led up to you discovering this art project and saying, "Send me through."
Yeah, I'm conscious that we only have, a short amount of time, but yeah,
Highlights. Share
the highlights,
highlights.
yeah, the highlights. So I was born into a family with a lot of inherited ancestral trauma in my matrilineal line, and my mother was really, really sick and had lots of mental health issues, and um, I was lucky enough to have my father growing up, who was this amazing man who was incredibly open and was really into spirituality and mythology. And he was kind of like my personal guide. And as much as I think as a child, I felt a lot of disconnect to being in a feminine body. I felt the disconnect of not having my kind of attachment with my mother, and the kind of wounding of what she had been through. And as you get older, you start to really understand the kind of neural connections and how it all plays out through trauma ancestrally. And um, I was made aware when I got old enough that there had been quite a lot of abuse for her, physically and sort of sexually. And it kind of, I started to connect a lot of dots. And as I started to kind of come of age myself and start to kind of journey through all of this, my dad used to take me on these pilgrimages to Glastonbury and introduce me to all these really interesting and wonderful people who, so eventually, kind of fast forward quite a while, but I guess he had always instilled a lot of magic into my former years. I ended up in a priestess school in Avalon, and just, I guess, yeah, a lot suddenly came together about um, trauma, the womb, the church, patriarchy, all those big subjects. And I had been on a really big journey to reconnect myself to, as we were talking about before we began, like being embodied, and what it meant to really embody this body and this soul journey, and how I was kind of ending up where I am now, which is doing birth work and being a birth keeper and healing womb trauma with women, and kind of going on the same thing of reconnecting them to their power and to source. And often women that have this sort of, I guess, similar situations that are occurring in their life, and usually not exactly the same thing, but stemming certainly from that same sense of a lack of connection to their embodiment for whatever reason. And so, yeah, I did a lot of different, lots and lots and lots of shadow work, and lots of different trainings, and lots of different healings, and lots of different modalities, and kind of um, I guess, and like a lot of us do, kind of went on that real seeker path to sort of connect all the dots, and really see it now. It feels very clear to me to sort of see things from the sort of priestess perspective, and from that perspective of Mother Earth and Gaia and the elements and our bodies and how we fit into the cosmos. And and especially as a birth keeper, I think really witnessing that power of when a woman is that literal lightning rod, and she is connecting to source, and she is bringing in this soul, and she's bringing them into embodiment, and how important that is, that journey, that sacred space, that birth journey for that child. And I guess it really informs how I birth keep as well. And I've gone on a big journey with herbs and birth keeping, and kind of authentic midwifery and that sort of thing as well. And I came across this project, and I thought, well, I really, really want to be involved in this, because over the last, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, I've been in circle with so many women who have said, oh my gosh, that really hit a nerve for me. I think maybe that's the witch wound. I think I've been here before. I think I feel like I've either had that kind of throat chakra kind of, strangulation, or I've had that singeing of my toes, and I'm scared. I'm actually genuinely feeling the fear of that wounding. And um I think, personally speaking, and having now a lot of women in my life that I feel that there is definitely something there about how we've been connected before, or how we've come to be together now. And um, I found it really interesting that when I wrote off for this, um, the day it arrived in my postbox was the day that I actually had to go and have some oral surgery, and I had to have a tooth removed. And it was a tooth that I broke during labor with my son 3 years earlier. And it was on the masculine side, it was deeply interconnected with the fact that my father had been super ill, and then we had cared for him, and then he had died just a few weeks before my son came earthside. And so breaking this tooth at home in labor, in my power, and then 3 years later kind of having gone on that cyclical journey with a lot of grief and a lot of joy and a lot of death and a lot of life, and seeing those real familial connections. um, it was really like, I just saw this thing in my postbox, and I was like, of course it would be today. And I've kind of ended up going on this little journey of ritually burying this tooth, and kind of really, uh, as you were saying, like how important, you know uh, we used to sort of understand how important teeth were, like, to our ancestors. They were this hugely, deeply, like, intrinsic mineral, deep kind of boulders within our body that we would have for our whole lives. And yeah, so it was really funny. And then when I went upstairs with my mouth all packed out and feeling gross, and having had this situation, and it was scary and traumatic. And when I was actually in the oral surgeon's chair that day, um, he had kind of held my head, and obviously been had to be quite brutal to remove this tooth. And as this happened, and I held the nurse's hand, and I was crying, and I was telling myself, you must let go, you must let go, you must let go, and surrender. And I was kind of mothering myself through it. And at the same time, he said something about getting his forceps. And I was born myself as a forceps baby. And I had this moment of, like, my head being maneuvered. And then, having spoken to another friend afterwards, we talked about how, when women were hung, and how, that connection to, um, yeah, that kind of deep connection, to all of this different threads, I guess. And so I came home, and I was a bit sort of out on painkillers or whatever, but I unraveled Anne's name, and I was like, okay, so Anne is my middle name, which of course initially was like, right, I've got to find out who this woman is. And I looked her up, and I didn't have a great deal of energy, and I knew that part of my process and part of my recovery for the next couple of days would actually be really helpful to have something to focus on that was kind of there in front of me, that I could not be on my phone or anything, and I would just sit with it. And it was the craziest thing, because it was almost as if the minute I just tapped into her, it was like I had no idea what I was going to do, and suddenly it was like she was just speaking through me, and it was like, I don't know if you can tell, but kind of, as soon as I turned the spoon upside down, I really saw that as the hangman's noose, and I thought, that's kind of, I don't know, it really felt. And so I did the noose, and I embroidered that around. And then of course the broom, for witches, is kind of sweeping away, and both that kind of double thing of sweeping away the past, but also of clearing and of transmuting. The cauldron, of course, the transmutation, the transformation, Ceridwen's cauldron, the fire, and her, just as this sort of being that was like persecuted and feels trapped, and and I haven't quite got there yet, but I guess at the moment I'm still in the kind of I'm still in the descent with her, but I'm hoping to really bring up more of the spiritual aspects in the moon, and kind of find a way to, so yeah, her healing, my healing journey, sorry, with my tooth, weirdly somehow all connected together. And I went on this huge deep journey for the next couple of days, just I felt with Anne, like really deeply honoring her, and what must that have felt like, to have been ostracized. And yeah, so I'll stop talking now, but yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
Thank you so much for sharing with all of the interconnectedness with what was going on in your life personally when you got this, when you wrote for it and you received it on the day. I mean, I wonder if the artist who you're requesting these spoons from, does she share about any process that she goes through as far as choosing a particular name for a particular person?
I don't know. She hasn't made it explicit if she does. I'm sure she, if she's, creating this project artistically, I'm sure she is on some level really connected to
Right,
who she's pulling out. I
right.
don't know.
And I mean, even if she's just saying pulling them out of a hat, or out of the bag, right? She's just pulling out the next one from the list, right? The timing of all of that, the synchronicity of the timing and the connectedness. And, we are meaning makers, we, especially those of us who've been on a seeker's path, we tend to get into the habit of seeing symbolism everywhere and finding meaning everywhere. And that's part of the healing journey, is to say, oh, this is meaningful and that's meaningful, and all these interconnected pieces are meaningful, which is so healing, even just to affirm and experience it that way, as opposed to this, what we were taught in school, that nothing really is connected, and nothing has any kind of significance or meaning, and it's this empty, dry life that we're destined for. It's like, no, thank you. I'm going to put poetic beauty and meaning everywhere. Thank you very much. That's how I want to live my life. So I appreciate you for doing so as well. And I'm so intrigued by this project. So and I can really feel the priestessing in this project, and I can imagine that anybody who discovers this project and reaches out to receive a spoon, it, it has some kind of an awareness of, I'm doing a healing by participating in this project. I'm creating something new with it. So I'm loving the hintings that you're giving as you're describing some of the imagery and the symbolism that you talked about. You're in the descent of really experiencing the suffering of this person, and the stripping away of everything of her life and what was precious to her. through the process of being persecuted. And I'm assuming that you're referring to the descent of, say, Persephone or Inanna, um, which listeners might be familiar with, these mythologies that are symbolic of our descent every month in menstruation into the underworld, the descent of um, the sun into the nighttime every day and every night, the descent of the moon into the darkness every dark of the moon, and the descent of our seasons into the winter every year. And so there's so much, when you say you're in the descent, there's so much meaning and symbolism um, from all of this rich priestessing mythology that I just wanted to bring into light for listeners and bring into the awareness of the listeners. Because as a fellow priestess, I'm like, descent, it brings up all these things just with that one word. It brings up all this meaning. And so I just wanted to speak to that. And then the priestessing process then is, and this is the same with birth. When we go into birth as birth keepers and as birthing people, there's a descent into that void, that place where life and death meet, where spirit and form meet, where all dualities come together. And it's a place of everything and nothing all at once. And this is the stuff of mysticism and connection with the divine, and where human and divine meets, all right there at that moment of emptiness, of nakedness, of completely being stripped of anything in the face of the power of birth, of new life coming into this world. And I can go on and on about this, as I'm sure you can too. So that journey into birth is often, we talk about it in that same mythological context of the descent. And then there's the return from that you were also referring to as you were starting to describe some of the other images that you would eventually add, of saying, okay, we've gone to that point of, everything being swept away with the witch's broom, everything being burned away, everything being boiled down and alchemized. And now we get to choose what we return with, what we're going to create, how we're going to nurture this new life that we're being resurrected into, that we're giving birth to, what we're going to build. And so I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit, just in what it's building for you. What do you see? And I know you're not quite there because you're still in the descent, but could you imagine what directions you're seeing and might be happening for you, and for what is Anne going to be bringing into this world through you in this resurrection that you're taking part in?
It's a really good question, and I think it feels very clear to me that she was persecuted by another woman, and I think that is maybe where my work is going, is in how we bring more awareness and healing to this intrinsic sort of witch wounding or feminine wounding. For me specifically, I mean, I know there's many ways you can go with it, but I feel that that we don't want to be burnt again. We don't want to be going around this cycle, which is really inherently traumatic and painful and deeply disturbing. And so I feel like for me it's really percolating around, I think it's that kind of that phrase that gets bandied around a lot, of how do we create like sacred space? How do we, even in the everyday, like how do we go about meeting one another without burning one another down? how can we come from that place of that containment of ourselves, and in order to really meet another person. And we all show up with our shadows and our wounds and our triggers. So how do we navigate that with one another? And do we have a set of, like, not rules, because rules are made to be broken, but are there tenets that we can work with within our work that allow us to see when that wounding is really taking over? How do we come back to anchoring ourselves in like that truth of our souls as being, all human and all here on this journey, and all here to kind of do the work of the next iteration of healing, as I see it anyway? That kind of what is our soul's purpose here? And I don't know, mine seems to be very intertwined with how I marry up the like with my mother, like how do I forgive, but also integrate an experience that I don't have the opportunity to change, and I can't heal it, but how do I integrate it in a healthy way? And how do I then utilize that, turning your poison to power, which is such an important one, I think. Yeah. What do you think? What's your next ascent?
There are some threads in what you were sharing there. When you started out with talking about how Anne was persecuted by another woman, and I heard some threads in what you were sharing about how can we come together, how can we forgive, how can we really receive and give to each other in ways that builds us up in this collective healing process. Because yes, we're on individual healing journeys, but that's not complete until we heal as a collective. And so what was coming up for me when you were sharing all of that is that the lesson of, I think, a big lesson that we can receive collectively from this experience of the persecution of the witches and the persecution of so many different populations around the world is that standing together is where we stand a chance.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I think I need to take a sacred pause.
Okay.
Give me 1 minute and I'll.
All right. So anyway, what I was saying was that the big lesson that it feels to me to come out of this for us collectively is how we can come together and work together towards this collective healing. And I feel like this project that you're working on is a perfect example of something that can happen. And also something that I have been really looking at and feeling into lately is how do we support each other and come together and let the things that might divide us or separate us actually be sources of greater intimacy and more connection. And that requires healing in and of itself to bridge those gaps. And it requires each of us to stretch and widen our capacity for forgiveness and for reaching across these things that seem to be dividing us. But the thing is, folks who are benefiting by, receiving the privileges of these systems of division and persecution that we're all suffering from, they're not really benefiting, but they think they are. And they want everyone that they're dominant over to be at odds with each other. And we fall
divide and conquer.
Right. And so we fall into that when we, for example, think that somebody else's approach to healing isn't as good as our approach. and go on and on about that and criticize each other for this or that. And there may be some validity in that, but my dream and my vision is for us to find ways to question each other and inspire each other into greater awareness and deeper healing and, more fruitful flourishing together, that doesn't have to involve shaming each other for where we see that somebody has done badly, or shaming each other for our shortcomings, right? Can we step away from the typical ways of relating that create more harm,
Yeah.
and move towards ways of relating that foster partnership and growing together and that uplift each other? So that's some of the message that I was receiving when you were sharing what you were sharing. Those are some of the threads that teased out for me in what you were sharing. Like, how can we relate to each other in ways that brings a healing balm to these wounds that we all share? And that ultimately, I feel, is what will heal the underlying wounds in the bullies and the dominators that are creating that perpetual need to dominate and bully and be greedy and take everything for themselves and overpower everyone. So I just feel like we can focus on relating in a different way that's not about dominating and overpowering and like that. So that's to answer your question, what I see in all of that. And yeah,
it's beautiful. It's beautiful. And I think it's exactly how I feel as well. I feel that there's this real culture of shaming and blaming and continuing to perpetuate pain. And I think ultimately, interestingly, those who maybe have fallen into that kind of, dominance or bullying, they're usually the ones with the biggest walls and with the most pain maybe behind them, right? That's one of the deepest understandings of like the shadow work and the trauma work, and is that we understand that there are these kind of narratives that play out, the idea of victim and oppressor, these sorts of things that kind of play out. And as you say, it seems to be that one of the ways that we could do that is to recognize that that's not a useful way for anything to change. But then the question is, does that person see it as wanting change if they are feeling like they are dominant and therefore in control, and therefore that makes them feel good, which, as you said, is like it's a complex and very nuanced one, isn't it? If you are benefiting from that behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Well, what's come to me in my meditations and in my experience around that is that I personally, and I imagine that I can extrapolate this to other people's experiences, that I personally have had the experience that I would be blind to my own privilege until some mysterious awakening that takes place. And it's not until I am somehow mysteriously ready for that awakening to my privilege and how I'm harming others that I will be able to see it.
Mm-hmm.
And even if people try to tell me that I'm harming them, I won't see it until I am ready.
Mm-hmm.
No, and especially if they're trying to tell me in a shaming way, if I'm not ready to see it, I won't see it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just put the blame back on them, that they're just being whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so it's not until there's some mysteriously sourced readiness within me that I'm able to see and own whatever it was that I was doing that was harming someone else, and start to take the steps to make the changes to end that and transform it into something that is beneficial for myself and others. Not beneficial for me, but beneficial for others. And that's a shift that we need collectively, that it's not just about each individual doing whatever they are doing to benefit themselves. Because if it's at the harm of others, at the expense of others, that benefit isn't true. That's stolen benefit, and it's at a deficit to their energetic, what things add up for them energetically and spiritually. They're running on a deficit. It's borrowed energy. It's stolen energy. It's harming anybody else. And so that creates a collective imbalance when there are some that are benefiting and others that are being harmed by their benefit. And so when we become aware of that, there's a mysterious awakening that happens to make one aware of that no one can shove down anyone's throat. It happens from within. And in my meditations, my experience, it arises from Mother Earth. It's like a sprout that comes up through the soles of our feet, that comes up through our pelvic floor and awakens within us this awareness that nobody can force on anyone else. And it has to do with the readiness of not only myself as an individual, but the readiness of the world to receive what's coming up through me, the readiness of the collective to receive this rebalancing of energy that's going to take place once I become aware of that imbalance and start to rectify it for myself individually. And then that starts to radiate out. So the vision that I received, the message I received when I was in deep meditation, asking, how will we heal this collective imbalance? How will these dominators, these bullies, these greed mongering, multi-quadrillionaires that have, one or two people having all the money in the world while all these people are starving and suffering? How is this imbalance going to be rectified? They have no motivation to do it. Nobody can tell them what to do. Well, the same way that it's happened for me on these countless smaller and bigger things that I've become aware of from some inner awakening. And that there's a readiness of all of the people having those inner awakenings, adding up to a certain energetic of being able to hold when, these super imbalanced, super dominating bullies who are addicted, on some horrible drug like heroin, to siphoning off of everybody else's energy. Them to realize that and come off of that drug, it's going to be huge withdrawals, and they're going to need big holding. They're going to need enough people to really have that sense of compassionate holding. So I don't know if we'll see that in our lifetime, or maybe on an individual or smaller community level. But that's the vision that I have, is that eventually there's going to be, from this intrinsic thing that's going to happen energetically for humanity as a collective. And what that's going to look like is probably going to be messy. It's already messy. If we survive this environmental crisis, if there's enough of us awakening to that and miracles start happening, because people get real creative at the moment of like, oh my gosh, are we going to survive? That's when real creativity starts to happen and real brilliance starts to awaken and like that. And as we're coming up with these brilliant solutions and miracles happen, then that's when these big healings can start to occur for people who are really ill in a big way. So I don't know if any of that makes sense, but we caught it all on the audio, so we can go back and listen later and see what I actually said.
No, I think it was an amazing transmission. I think it was really, really spot on. And as you say, it's kind of, it's like that tower card, isn't it? It's like the crumbling, and there's going to be a need for so much compassion. And it's really interesting to see how people, you know, who have any kind of media attention or are kind of well-known figures, of how they are, you know, either, you know, Christ-like or then suddenly, you know, vilified. And it's such a funny game, because already within the media that is a game in and of itself. But we're talking about real human beings, and I find it really interesting how we can dehumanize people, and how that is a big problem in and of itself, in terms of this work, and in terms of how we decide to label, or, as you say, I think the shame one is it's such a deep wound, and it is so deteriorating and so tough, because it speaks so deeply to being ostracized, or being out of our clan, or, you know, out of those the basic things that we need to survive as an individual, but also as a collective. And I think it speaks to that somewhat, of how we've ended up in this situation where there is such a, you know, a maelstrom of shaming and blaming. And yeah, it's really interesting to step back and really kind of acknowledge when these storms happen, even on a smaller level, you know, with not so well-known people, kind of like witnessing everyone playing their part in some strange TV show, and you can really see everyone playing their roles really well, you know, and it's so fascinating to kind of have that awareness. Yeah.
Well, listen, Laura, I could go on and on with you all afternoon. Like I said earlier, or I say this all the time, I get on these calls, and but I just want to give folks a chance, if they wanted to reach out to you and learn more about this project, or more about your work that you shared about, how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so the project is Karen Thompson's project, so that is the Medicine Spoon Memorial. But for me, my name is Laura Swann, and my website is theholisticbirthkeeper.co.uk. And yeah, I think my work is shifting, and as you said, I think that this descent time is a really interesting one, and we'll see where it goes. I'm hopefully holding a big women's circle in summer solstice, and yeah, some other little kind of projects that are coming up around, yeah, everything we've been speaking about, and coming back to our mother and our womb, and Mother Earth. And so yeah, that feels important to say.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you so much. So hopefully, will you be able to share links for me for
Yes.
those?
Yeah.
Well, several links. One for the medicine
Yeah.
project, so that in case anyone else wants to participate. Do you have to be a citizen in the UK to participate in it?
Oh, that's a really good question. I'm not sure, actually. It'd be good to ask her, reach out. As you say, it could be an offshoot onto a whole new, much bigger
Yeah.
project.
Great.
Yeah.
So, okay, so folks can reach out to her, and also to Laura through links in the show notes. So hopefully you'll share some of those links with us. All right, and folks know that if you want to learn more about what's happening at the Womb Centered Healing Temple, you can go to wombcenteredhealing.com, subscribe to the newsletter, and you'll be notified about new episodes of the podcast, as well as blog articles and upcoming courses and events. You can also, if you're watching this on YouTube, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and click the notification bell, so that you'll get notifications about the latest episodes that are out on YouTube. All right, that's all for now. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast, Laura, and until next time.